I hadn't heard my brother's voice in almost 2 decades. Not on birthdays, not at funerals, not when our mother died quietly in her sleep one winter morning. So when the doorman called my apartment and said, "Sir, there's a man here claiming to be your brother," my first thought wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Because people don't just disappear from your life for 18 years. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, unless something broke beyond repair. My name is Jonathan Hale. I'm 65 years old, and the last time I saw my younger brother, Ethan, he was walking out of my life with my company idea, my business partner, and the woman I planned to marry. 3 weeks ago, Apex Systems went public. By the end of that day, financial analysts estimated my net worth at $74 million. 4 days later, Ethan showed up at my door. The irony still makes me shake my head. I was standing alone in the corner of our headquarters in San Mateo, watching the stock ticker crawl upward on the big screen. Employees were cheering. Champagne corks popped. Someone handed me a glass I never drank from. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. I'd spent 42 years in enterprise software. 3 failed ventures. One that almost destroyed me. Countless nights sleeping under my desk, debugging code while younger men chased faster dreams. Apex wasn't glamorous. We built logistics intelligence software, the uncelebrated backbone that kept global supply chains from collapsing. It wasn't flashy, but it was necessary. The company had belonged to my mentor, Leonard Wu, until pancreatic cancer took him at 72. Leonard had no children. I'd been his lead architect for nearly 2 decades. When he passed, his will left me controlling interest. "You stayed," he'd told me in a recorded message. "You fixed what others abandoned. This is yours now." That morning, as the market opened, I stood there wishing Leonard could have seen it. Instead, my phone buzzed nonstop with congratulations from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. And then, buried among them, with a memory I hadn't opened in almost 2 decades. A photograph. 2 young men standing outside a rundown apartment in Palo Alto. Both smiling. Both believing the future was ours. Ethan and me. 18 years ago, we were inseparable. He was 3 years younger. Louder. Bolder. Always convinced the world owed him something for his ambition. I was the quiet one. The planner. The builder. We'd spent nearly 2 years developing a decentralized inventory tracking concept, long before it was fashionable. Nights at the kitchen table, whiteboards, cheap coffee, dreams bigger than our bank accounts. Then he met Claire. She was charismatic, impatient, and relentlessly persuasive. Within weeks, she convinced Ethan that I was holding him back. "Jonathan's too cautious. You're the real visionary. Why should you share credit with someone afraid of risk?" One night, I came home to find our shared server wiped. The next morning, Ethan had filed incorporation paperwork without my name on it. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He laughed. "You'd never have gone all the way," he said. "I did what needed to be done." Claire stood beside him. My fiancée, Margaret, defended me at first, but poison works slowly. Within months, she believed I lacked ambition. She returned my ring with shaking hands and said she needed someone unafraid of success. The startup collapsed a year later. Ethan disappeared. No apology. No explanation. Just silence. I rebuilt quietly. No lawsuits. No public bitterness. Just work. Leonard's company became my refuge. Line by line, system by system, I proved my value again. And now, at 65, with Apex listed and my face plastered across financial news sites, the past came knocking. Literally. The doorman's voice crackled through the intercom. "He's here with luggage, sir." And a woman. My hands went cold. I knew immediately this wasn't a reunion. People don't show up with suitcases to apologize. I told the doorman to send them up. I had about 90 seconds while the elevator climbed. 90 seconds to decide whether I'd end this cleanly or finally see who my brother had become. The elevator chimed. I opened the door. Ethan stood there, thicker around the waist, hair thinning at the temples, wearing a smile that hadn't changed at all. Beside him was his wife, Lauren, and 3 large suitcases. "Jonathan," he said, arms open. "Look at you. We've got so much to catch up on. I didn't move. 18 years collapsed into one quiet moment. And in that silence, I understood something Leonard once taught me. Never interrupt someone when they're about to show you exactly who they are. I stepped aside and let them in. That single motion, barely a step, changed everything. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rolled the first suitcase across my hardwood floors like he belonged there. Lauren followed, scanning the apartment with professional curiosity, the way real estate agents do when they're deciding how long they'll tolerate a place. "This is spacious," she said, already drifting toward the windows. "You did well for yourself. Not we're proud of you. Not thank you for seeing us. Just you did well, as if my life were an investment that had finally paid off." I closed the door behind them. The apartment was large but restrained. 2,000 square feet. Neutral tones. Nothing extravagant. I'd bought it anticipating the public listing, not to impress anyone. Ethan whistled softly. "San Mateo skyline, huh? Must be nice waking up to that every day." I watched him. He'd always been good at this. Casual admiration wrapped around expectation. I showed them the guest suite. 2 connected rooms, private bath. Ethan tested the mattress, opened drawers, inspected closet space. "This works," he said. "Not thank you. Just this works." Lauren was already on her phone. I caught fragments as she stepped into the adjoining room. "We're in O. He's alone. Huge place. This'll be easy." I turned away and walked to the kitchen. Leonard's voice echoed in my head again. "Documentation isn't aggression. It's protection." I placed my phone face down on the counter, recording. Ethan found me 20 minutes later. "Let's talk," he said, leaning against the island like we were back in our 20s. Man to man. I poured coffee slowly, gave him time to settle into confidence. "I know what I did back then wasn't right," he said. "I was young, ambitious. Things got messy. You took everything." I replied evenly. He waved it off. "We collaborated. That's how startups work. History just remembers the winner." I slid the mug toward him. I saw the numbers, he continued. 74 million. "That's incredible, Jonathan. Truly." There it was. The number had entered the room. "You didn't come here to congratulate me," I said. He smiled. "I came because families should be together when things finally work out. And what does that look like to you?" He took a sip, grimaced, then continued anyway. "A partnership," he said. "Something formal. A recognition of what we started together. 35% of your Apex equity feels fair." I almost laughed. "You haven't worked in enterprise software in over a decade." "Business instincts don't expire," he replied smoothly. "And courts understand oral agreements." I met his eyes. "We never had one." "Maybe," he said, "but memory is flexible, especially when witnesses agree." Lauren appeared in the doorway at just the right moment. "We don't want this to get ugly," she said softly. "Lawyers drain everyone. We'd rather stay here a while, reconnect, rebuild trust." "Stay here." "Not ask. Stay." I nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," I said. Ethan's smile tightened. "Don't take too long. We're not getting younger." That night, I locked my office door. 2 calls. The first was to Daniel Mercer, the estate attorney who'd structured Leonard's trust. "I need revisions," I said. "Immediate." The second was to a private investigator Leonard once recommended. "I need everything," I told her. "Finances, employment history, legal exposure." 2 people. "Related?" she asked. "My brother," I said. She paused. "I'll be thorough." I didn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, voices drifted down the hallway. "He's softer than you said," Lauren whispered. "He always was," Ethan replied. "We just have to wait him out." I recorded every word. By morning, the apartment no longer felt like mine. Ethan had rearranged the living room furniture without asking. The sofa angled differently. One of my lamps had been moved closer to the window. Small things, but deliberate. Territorial. Lauren had discovered my grocery delivery account and placed an order heavy on organic labels and expensive wine. I said nothing. I took screenshots. Documentation is quiet. Ethan cornered me near the kitchen island before lunch. "We should talk timelines," he said. "Lauren and I have expenses. Getting settled again isn't cheap." "Settled how?" I asked. "Here," he replied, as if it were obvious. "With you." until everything's formalized. How much? I asked. He didn't hesitate. 20,000, just to stabilize things. An advance? I asked. He nodded. On what I'm owed. I looked at him for a long moment. You're not owed anything, I said calmly. His expression hardened, just for a second. Then it softened again into practiced patience. Jonathan, he said, lowering his voice, you're sitting on more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. Don't become the kind of man who forgets where he came from. I remember exactly where I came from, I said. That's why I'm careful. He scoffed and walked away. That afternoon, Daniel Mercer called. Legally, he said, you have no obligation to your brother. In fact, given the estrangement and his timing, explicit disinheritance would be advisable. I want it airtight, I said. We'll cite abandonment, opportunistic reentry, and absence of contribution, Daniel replied. And we'll assign your assets to causes you actively support. That strengthens the document. I thought of the mentorship programs Leonard had quietly funded. STEM education, I said. Underfunded schools. Apprenticeships. Daniel smiled through the phone. Excellent. 3 days later, the investigator called. We need to meet in person, she said. We sat in a quiet cafe near the waterfront. She slid a folder across the table. Ethan and Lauren were drowning. Credit card debt, well over $200,000. Mortgage delinquency. Multiple job terminations. A restraining order filed by Lauren's sister over unpaid loans. Patterns of conflict. Blame. Short tenures. He's been telling people you're mentally declining, she added. Laying groundwork. I closed the folder. That night, Ethan filed suit. He claimed foundational partnership, oral agreement, emotional damages, entitlement to 40% of Apex. I forwarded everything to Daniel. This won't survive preliminary hearing, he said, but we can strengthen our position. How? I asked. Let them show who they are, he replied. I knew exactly what he meant. I called a family meeting that evening. Ethan and Lauren sat across from me at the dining table, confident now. The lawsuit had given them leverage, or at least they believed it had. I've been thinking, I said, folding my hands, about the partnership, about what you're asking. Lauren leaned forward first. We're open to compromise. We really want peace. Ethan nodded. Court's messy. We'd rather keep this in the family. I agree, I said, which is why I need to see something first. Their eyes sharpened. Before I consider equity transfers or financial support, I continued, I need to know you're here for the right reasons. Not just money. And how do we prove that? Ethan asked, already irritated. 6 months, I said. Volunteering. Lauren blinked. Volunteering. I fund a nonprofit that teaches coding and robotics to underprivileged students, I explained. You'll volunteer 20 hours a week. Teaching, mentoring, showing up. Ethan laughed once. That's it. It's not a punishment, I said evenly. It's a test of character. And the lawsuit? Lauren asked. It gets withdrawn as a gesture of good faith, I replied. At the end of 6 months, if I believe you're genuinely committed, I'll reconsider everything. They exchanged a glance. 6 months of pretending was a small price for tens of millions. We'll do it, Ethan said. Happy to. The nonprofit was called Bright Path Labs. Converted warehouse. Old desks. Kids hungry for opportunity and short on patience. The director, Marisol Vega, had built it from scratch after leaving a lucrative engineering job. We don't need saviors, she told Ethan and Lauren on the first day. We need consistency. They smiled, took photos, posted captions about giving back. The first week was flawless performance. By the third, cracks appeared. Ethan delegated tutoring to teenagers so he could take calls outside. Lauren spent more time on her phone than with students. Complaints trickled in. These kids are exhausting, Lauren muttered one night at dinner. They don't even try. They should be grateful, Ethan added. We're doing this for them. I said nothing. I recorded everything. By month 3, Marisol called me privately. They're not helping, she said gently. They're tolerated. Document it, I replied. Please. At home, patients were thin. This is humiliating, Ethan snapped one night. You're enjoying this. I'm observing, I said. At month 5, he grabbed my arm in the hallway. Enough, he hissed. Pay us now or we escalate. I filed the incident with my attorney. 2 weeks later, the stage was set. By the end of the 5th month, the pretense had collapsed under its own weight. Ethan didn't announce it. He didn't make a declaration or issue a complaint. He simply stopped trying. The volunteer hours at Bright Path Labso, carefully negotiated at the beginning, became irregular, then sporadic, then mostly fictional. He arrived late when he arrived at all, left early with vague excuses, claimed meetings that couldn't be verified, calls that took place in hallways while students waited. When Marisol gently asked him to log his hours more precisely, he laughed and said, "You people really love your paperwork." What he didn't realize was that paperwork was the entire point. At first, the staff tried to accommodate him. They reassigned him to lower-impact tasks, organizing donated equipment, supervising open lab hours, shadowing instructors instead of leading anything himself. They gave him the benefit of the doubt longer than I would have. Bright Path believed in rehabilitation, in second chances, in the idea that consistency could be taught. By month 5, they stopped pretending to. Meaningful responsibilities quietly disappeared. Students were no longer paired with him. His name vanished from schedules. When he showed up, someone would thank him for coming and hand him a box of cables to sort or ask him to wipe down keyboards. He noticed. Of course he did. His resentment sharpened into something brittle and dangerous. Lauren unraveled faster. She had entered the arrangement with a performance in mind-soft voice, charitable smile, the posture of a woman enduring something beneath her station. For the first few weeks, she managed it well enough. She read from prepared notes during tutoring sessions, asked scripted questions, smiled at parents during drop-off. But patience had never been her strength. One afternoon, a 13-year-old girl knocked over a half-full water bottle near Lauren's feet. It wasn't dramatic. No electronics were damaged. The girl froze, mortified, already apologizing. Lauren recoiled as if she'd been splashed with acid. "Are you serious?" she snapped, lifting her foot. "Do you have any idea how expensive these shoes are?" The room went quiet. The girl's face flushed crimson. Another volunteer stepped in quickly, kneeling to mop up the spill, murmuring reassurances. Lauren stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, breathing fast, more offended than embarrassed. Later that day, Marisol wrote it down. Time, witnesses, exact phrasing. Another week, Lauren was assigned to sit with a beginner and 11-year-old boy struggling through basic loop logic. He'd been stuck for nearly 20 minutes, frustrated to the point of tears, clicking and unclicking the same block of code like it might eventually comply out of pity. Lauren sighed loudly, checked her phone, then stood. "I have a headache," she announced, already grabbing her bag. "I didn't sign up for this level of remedial work." She left without waiting for a response. That went into the record too. Bright Path, as director, didn't confront them. She didn't scold or threaten. She simply documented. She had learned, long before Ethan and Lauren ever walked through the doors, that people who behave this way were already telling you everything you needed to know. So did I. Every missed hour, every early departure, every complaint, every staff email that began with careful diplomacy and ended in concern. I didn't intervene. I didn't warn them. I didn't adjust the terms. The agreement was simple: 6 months of consistent service. Show up, do the work, demonstrate intent. They failed without being pushed. At home, the tension thickened until it felt structural, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ethan's patience dissolved first. The charm he had worn like a tailored jacket began to fray at the seams. He stopped pretending to be grateful, stopped pretending this arrangement was mutual. One evening, as I closed my office door and turned toward the hallway, he was standing there too, close, blocking the doorway with casual precision. "This has gone on long enough," he said. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "We've done your little morality play," he continued. "We showed up. We jumped through the hoops. You owe us." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step back. "Owe you what?" I asked. He smiled, the kind that never reached his eyes. 200,000. Immediately. Then we formalized the equity transfer. The words were rehearsed. He'd practiced them, maybe in the mirror, maybe with Lauren late at night, whispering numbers like incantations. "That was never the agreement," I said. He leaned in closer, invading space deliberately now. Then we amend the lawsuit. Emotional distress. Elder abuse. You've been manipulating us. Courts don't love that. I stepped around him calmly, slipping past his shoulder as if he were a piece of furniture. 5 weeks, I said, walking toward the kitchen. That was the deal. He laughed, then sharp, humorless, brittle. You really think you're untouchable, he said. I didn't respond, because the truth was simpler than any argument I could have made. I was prepared. 2 days later, Daniel Mercer confirmed the date. The Bay Area Innovation and Impact Forum would be held at the Moscone Center. Apex Systems have been invited to receive recognition for enterprise contribution and community investment language that translated cleanly into press coverage, institutional trust, and reputational permanence. I was given 10 minutes on stage. 10 minutes was more than enough. I didn't tell Ethan and Lauren immediately. There was no reason to. I waited until the information had weight, until anticipation would do the work for me. 3 days before the event, I mentioned it casually over dinner. There's an awards ceremony, I said, passing the salad bowl. I'd like you there as family. Ethan's eyes lit up instantly, like a switch had been thrown. This is where you announce the partnership? He asked, unable to contain the eagerness. I'm announcing my legacy plans, I replied. Lauren squeezed his hand under the table, her smile practiced and radiant. We wouldn't miss it. They dressed accordingly. Ethan bought a new suit. Lauren chose a dress that balanced elegance with visibility, expensive without being ostentatious. They moved through the days leading up to the forum with renewed confidence. The lawsuit suddenly transformed in their minds from leverage into inevitability. They believed the pressure had worked. They believed my silence meant surrender. They believed wrong. The night of the forum, the ballroom glittered with familiarity. Executives I'd sparred with for years. Journalists who knew how to listen between sentences. Board members who understood the value of documentation, of patterns, of restraint. Ethan and Lauren sat in the front row. I watched them from backstage, their posture upright, their expressions satisfied. They waved at people they didn't know, as if recognition were already assured. I felt no anger, just clarity. When my name was announced, the applause rose, politely measured, professional, respectful. I stepped to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the audience. Thank you, I began. Apex Systems is a story about persistence, about patience, and about choosing the right legacy. The first slide appeared behind me. A photograph from long ago. 2 brothers standing in front of a Palo Alto apartment. Younger, leaner, uncertain. This, I said evenly, is my younger brother, Ethan. 18 years ago. The room stilled, and the stage finally was set. I didn't pause for effect. Pauses invite interruption. They allow people to project motives, to prepare rebuttals, to regain footing. I had no interest in giving Ethan that gift. I let the silence settle naturally as the audience took in the image behind me, the 2 of us in that photograph, frozen in a time when the future was still undefined. When I continued, my voice remained steady, almost conversational. 4 days after Apex Systems went public, I said, my brother re-entered my life. The slide changed. A time-stamped security image filled the screen. Ethan and Lauren on my front step, suitcases lined neatly beside them like props. The time and date were crisp in the corner. Impossible to misinterpret. Not to reconcile, I continued. Not to reconnect, but to demand control. A low murmur rippled through the room. I heard the shift in posture before I saw it, the subtle lean forward of journalists, the tightening of expressions among board members who had lived long enough to recognize patterns forming in real time. Ethan shifted in his seat. Lauren's smile, still present a moment earlier, had frozen into something brittle and unconvincing. I clicked again. Audio filled the hall. He's always been soft. We just have to wait him out. The recording wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The acoustics of the room carried it cleanly, every word landing with surgical precision. I watched Ethan rise halfway out of his seat, face flushing, then hesitate as he registered movement at the edges of the room. Security hadn't closed the exits dramatically. They hadn't needed to. They simply positioned themselves where exits existed, a quiet reminder that this was not a space for disruption. This, I said, without looking at him, is why documentation matters. The next slide appeared. Legal filings. The lawsuit, as it had been submitted. Key passages highlighted claims of entitlement based on a venture that had failed nearly 2 decades earlier, long before Apex existed in any meaningful form. The language was vague, emotional, conspicuously light on verifiable detail. I didn't editorialize. I didn't mock the phrasing or question the intelligence behind it. I let the words speak for themselves. Those claims, I said, were unrelated to Apex's work, its formation, or its growth. Another click. Financial records replaced the filings. Debt totals. Foreclosure notices. Employment histories showing repeated terminations. Patterns of short tenure followed by conflict. The information was presented clinically, anonymized where required, sourced cleanly. Guess now. Not loud, not theatrical, but unmistakable. I could feel the audience recalibrating, not reacting emotionally, but structurally. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a case study. I didn't share this to humiliate anyone, I said. I share it because context matters. A pause then, not for drama, but because this was the point where misinterpretation could creep in if I rushed. I required 6 months of volunteer service, I continued. Not as punishment, as proof of intent. The screen shifted again. Photographs appeared. Ethan seated in a chair, phone in hand, while students waited. Timestamps visible. Context undeniable. Lauren mid-gesture, face contorted in frustration, pointing at a child just out of frame. A still taken from security camera, grainy, but unmistakable. Written statements followed. Excerpt from Bright Path's director. From instructors. From volunteers who had tried, earnestly, to help. They failed that test, I said simply. Ethan stood then, fully this time, shouting something I didn't hear over the sudden rise in ambient noise. His words weren't important. Not anymore. Security moved efficiently. No force. No spectacle. Just inevitability. I didn't turn to watch him go. My final slide appeared as the room settled again. My will. Redacted, but unmistakable. Legal formatting. Signatures. Dates. Structure that left no room for interpretation. My assets, I said, are allocated to education programs serving students who show up, work hard, and build something real. A pause. My brother will receive $1, I continued. Intentionally. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy with recognition. Then the applause began. It wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. It rose steadily, sustained, deliberate. The kind of applause that wasn't about approval, but acknowledgement. Ethan was escorted out, his voice fading into the hallway, still arguing, still demanding, still certain that volume could substitute for substance. I felt nothing. No triumph. No vindication. Only closure. The applause didn't follow me off stage. That was intentional. Daniel met me in the corridor with a nod, nothing more. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't comment on the reaction or the press already gathering near the exits. We had both learned long ago that the absence of commentary was its own kind of respect. I didn't stay for the reception. There was no reason to linger among congratulations that weren't meant for me as a person, only as a symbol. Apex had received its recognition. The rest was noise. The lawsuit collapsed faster than Ethan ever imagined. 3 days after the forum, Judge Eleanor Watkins dismissed the case with prejudice. Her ruling was concise and unsparing. There was no theatrical language, no indulgent commentary. She didn't need it. The documentation spoke for itself. The plaintiff, she wrote, had demonstrated a documented pattern of opportunistic behavior, misrepresentation, and coercive intent. The claims lacked merit, credibility, and factual grounding. The court found no evidence of elder abuse, emotional distress attributable to the defendant, or any contractual entitlement to the assets in question. Court costs were assigned to Ethan. The attorney representing him withdrew the same afternoon. I read the ruling once. Then I closed the file. Without the leverage of the lawsuit, Ethan had nothing left. No legal angle. No moral argument. No credibility. He tried to posture for a few days, posting vague statements online about betrayal, about family loyalty, about powerful people silencing dissent. They were poorly received. A few comments, mostly from strangers who didn't know him and didn't care enough to investigate further. The posts disappeared within a week. The private investigator called me later that week with updates I hadn't asked for. Ethan had left California. He was staying with a friend outside Reno, working overnight security at a casino. The job paid hourly, required minimal interaction, and came with no upward trajectory. It suited him more than he would ever admit. Lauren had moved back to the Midwest. She didn't leave dramatically. No public statements. No scorched earth. She packed quietly and returned to a place where people remembered her as someone before the lawsuits, before the volunteering, before the unraveling. Their marriage dissolved the way many do when the central fiction collapses, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone brave enough to admit it had been inevitable from the beginning. They were broke, not ruined by me, just finally exposed. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt finished. The apartment lingered longer than it should have. Too much space, too many echoes, rooms that had absorbed conversations I no longer needed to remember. I sold it within the month, accepting an offer that was fair but not sentimental. The new place was smaller. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors that caught the morning light, close enough to Bright Path Labs that I could walk there without thinking. Neighbors waved without knowing my name. That felt right. Marisol brought soup the first night I moved in. She didn't make a speech. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She set the container on the counter, hugged me once, and changed the subject. A teenager from the program knocked later that evening. He held his laptop like it was something fragile. "Sorry," he said. "I know it's late, but you said any time." We sat at the kitchen table and traced a logic error back to its source. He left smiling, lighter than when he arrived. That felt like family. On quiet evenings, loneliness still visited. I won't pretend otherwise. It arrived without malice, just presence settling into the corners of the room like a reminder of roads not taken. I let it sit when it came. I didn't fight it. I didn't romanticize it either. But regret didn't accompany it. Legacy isn't about what you keep. It's about what you pass forward and who you choose to protect. Ethan taught me that blood doesn't make someone family. Consistency does. Showing up does. And that lesson was worth every year it took to learn. I spend my mornings differently now. That difference isn't dramatic. There's no ceremony to it. No conscious rejection of the old rhythms. The change announced itself quietly, over time, the way habits do when they no longer serve you and simply fall away. I wake without urgency. There are no ticker screens glowing before sunrise. No alerts stacked overnight, like small emergencies demanding triage. My phone stays silent unless I want it otherwise. When I wake, the light comes in first thin and pale at the edges of the blinds, growing warmer as the minutes pass, climbing the wall as if testing whether I'm ready to join it. Some mornings I lie still longer than I should. Not because I'm tired, but because stillness no longer feels like a luxury. It feels earned. I listen to the building wake around me, the muted footfalls of a neighbor upstairs, the distant sound of a garbage truck, the low mechanical sigh of plumbing adjusting to collective use. Once, silence like this would have made me uneasy. Silence used to mean something had gone wrong. Now it simply means nothing has. Most days I walk to Bright Path Labs just after sunrise. The route is familiar enough that my feet know it without instruction. I pass the same row of sycamores, their bark peeling in irregular patterns like maps no one has finished drawing. I cross the same intersection where the light lingers too long on red, daring pedestrians to decide how much patience they truly possess. The neighborhood is quiet at that hour, still deciding whether it wants to be awake. A woman jogs past me with a dog that looks more alert than she does. The dog's ears twitch at every sound, processing the world at a pace that suggests nothing should ever be taken for granted. Someone unlocks a cafe, metal gate rattling upward, and the smell of coffee drifts into the street before the door even opens. It reaches me halfway down the block, faint but unmistakable, like a promise that the day has structure whether or not I acknowledge it. Bright Path Labs sits back from the road, unassuming by design. The building doesn't try to impress anyone. Its paint has faded unevenly. One of the front windows still bears a hairline crack from a baseball thrown years ago, the damage never quite worth fixing, never quite bad enough to ignore. A small plaque near the entrance lists donors in modest lettering. My name is there, but it doesn't stand out. That was intentional. Inside, the air smells faintly of dust and old electronics. Coffee, too, eventually. Someone always brings it. The lights flicker on one row at a time, buzzing softly before settling into a steady glow. Computers hum to life with the patient persistence of things built to endure more than they were promised. There's something comforting about machines that don't pretend to be anything else. Students drift in slowly. They don't arrive all at once. There's no bell to herd them, no authority demanding punctuality. They come when they come, drawn by routine or curiosity or the simple fact that this is a place they're allowed to exist without explanation. Backpacks slung low, hoodies pulled tight, half awake, half guarded, but hopeful in the particular way people are when they've chosen to show up anyway. Some nod when they see me. A few wave. Most don't acknowledge me at all, and I consider that a success. They sit down, open their laptops, and sink immediately into problems that feel larger than they are because everything feels larger when you don't yet know its shape. I sit with them, not at the front of the room, not behind a desk. I take an empty chair wherever there's space, leaning in only when invited, listening more than I speak. Not as a benefactor, not as a savior, not as a man with resources to dispense, just as someone who remembers. I remember how confusing code can be when you're starting out. How syntax feels arbitrary and unforgiving. How a single misplaced character can collapse an entire program and make you question whether logic itself has turned against you. I remember the shame of asking for help when you think everyone else understands something you've barely begun to decode. I remember staring at the screen so long that the text stopped looking like language at all, dissolving into shapes that accuse you of wasting time you couldn't afford to lose. Mostly, I remember how long it takes before logic stops feeling like a foreign language and starts feeling like a tool. That memory keeps me patient. One afternoon, the room was quieter than usual. Rain had started unexpectedly, tapping against the windows in irregular patterns that made concentration difficult. A few students had stayed home. Others hunched deeper into their chairs, shoulders raised instinctively, as if rain could seep through glass and circuitry alike. A boy named Mateo sat 2 seats away from me. He had been working on the same problem for nearly an hour, his fingers hovering over the keyboard more often than they moved. Every so often he would type something, pause, then undo it with quick, precise keystrokes. He couldn't have been older than 14. Sharp eyes, careful hands. The kind of kid who learned early that mistakes carried consequences. That precision wasn't about pride but survival. His backpack was frayed at the seams, mended in one corner with a patch that didn't quite match. Eventually, he leaned back and looked up. "Why do you help us?" he asked. The question wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to draw attention. It simply existed, offered without defensiveness or expectation. I turned toward him. It wasn't confrontational, just curious. He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to be here. You could be anywhere." He'd overheard someone mention my net worth earlier that week. I hadn't noticed at the time, but kids hear everything, even when you think they're buried in their own worlds, sealed off behind screens and headphones. For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because the first answers that surfaced were incomplete. They were tidy explanations, socially acceptable ones. They would have satisfied the question without honoring it. I thought about Ethan, about 18 years of silence that had felt, at the time, like protection, about the anger I carried longer than I realized, mistaking it for clarity because clarity felt safer than grief. I thought about how easy it is to leave when leaving costs you nothing. Because someone once stayed when it would have been easier to leave, I said finally. And that made all the difference. Mateo nodded slowly, not like someone agreeing, like someone storing information for later use. Filing it away until it might become relevant to a version of himself he hadn't met yet. Okay, he said, turning back to his screen. We went back to the problem. After Mateo returned to his work, the room settled again into its familiar rhythm. Keys clicking, chairs shifting, the low hum of machines doing exactly what they were designed to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Outside, the rain thickened, streaking the windows into uneven lines that bent the world just enough to soften it. I stayed where I was. In the past, moments like this would have felt unproductive, idle, wasted. I would have measured the time against outcomes, deliverables, milestones that could be articulated to someone else as justification. Now, I let the moment exist without defense. When the session ended, students packed up slowly. A few lingered to ask questions they'd been holding back. Others left without a word, their silence neither rude nor grateful, just complete. I locked the door behind the last of them and stood for a moment in the empty room. The quiet was different when no one else was there. It carried a residue of effort, of thinking done in earnest. Whiteboards still bore half-erased equations. A chair sat slightly askew where someone had leaned back too far and corrected themselves at the last second. I straightened it. The habit surprised me. Once, I would have left it as it was, a symbolic refusal to tidy what wasn't mine to control. Now I corrected small displacements without attaching meaning to them. On the walk home, I took the long route. Not because I had anywhere else to be, but because I could. The rain had eased into a mist, light enough to ignore, heavy enough to feel. The streetlights reflected off the pavement, stretching themselves into elongated shapes that wavered as I passed. I thought about my brother. Not often, but sometimes, and always unexpectedly. It wasn't anger that surfaced anymore, that had burned itself out, exhausted by repetition and time. What remained was quieter, harder to categorize. A sadness without urgency. I remembered him as he'd been before everything calcified, before resentment became his default posture, before entitlement hardened into identity. I remembered his laugh when it was still spontaneous, his certainty that the world would eventually recognize what he believed he deserved. We had been close once, or close enough. There were summers when we shared a room, the air too warm for sleep, whispering about futures we assumed would arrive fully formed if we waited long enough. We argued about trivial things, then music, movies, who had cheated whom in some forgotten game. Arguments that ended not with silence, but with exhaustion. We might have grown old comparing notes on life, arguing about politics we barely understood at first and never fully agreed on later, complaining about our backs, about how quickly time seemed to move once you stopped tracking it by school years and started tracking it by losses. We might have remembered our parents with softened edges, allowing the sharp parts to blur as distance did its quiet work. Instead, we became strangers linked only by shared history and opposite choices. I wondered sometimes whether Ethan thought about that version of us too, or whether he had rewritten the past so completely that nothing like it remained. At home, the apartment greeted me without expectation. The place was modest, intentionally so. 2 bedrooms, one of which remained largely empty except for a desk and a shelf of books I hadn't yet decided where to place. Hardwood floors that creaked in certain spots, announcing movement without accusation. I cooked simply, meals that required attention but not planning, food that could be adjusted midstream without consequence. I ate at the small table by the window, watching the evenings settle into the neighborhood, lights appearing one by one like confirmations that other lives were unfolding in parallel. Sometimes loneliness visited. It didn't knock. It never did. It arrived the way weather does, gradually, almost politely, filling the space without demanding acknowledgement. I let it stay when it came. I didn't try to drown it out with noise or activity. I didn't mistake it for regret or assume it meant something was wrong. Loneliness, I had learned, wasn't a verdict. It was simply evidence that I was no longer numbing myself with motion. Regret, on the other hand, never arrived. I examined that absence carefully, suspicious at first. I expected it to surface eventually, disguised as second-guessing or nostalgia. But didn't. I didn't regret protecting myself. I didn't regret choosing legacy over appeasement. Appeasement had cost me enough already. Years of silence framed as peace. Concessions mistaken for generosity. The slow erosion of boundaries justified by shared blood. I had learned slowly, expensively, that peace doesn't come from winning. Winning implies opposition, a score to be kept. It demands that someone else lose. Peace comes from clarity, from knowing you acted deliberately, ethically, and without cruelty. That last part mattered more than I expected. There were moments, brief, tempting moments, when cruelty would have been easy. While I could have sharpened words, prolonged humiliation, extracted satisfaction from exposure. I chose not to, not because I was above it, because I didn't want to carry it. That decision, more than any legal victory or public reckoning, was what allowed the quiet to feel clean. Before bed, I sometimes read through old notebooks, not business plans or legal documents. Handwritten notes from earlier versions of myself, ideas abandoned, goals revised, fears articulated in margins and crossed out later with unnecessary force. I recognized the person who wrote them. I didn't feel embarrassed for him. I felt protective. He had done what he could with what he knew. Sleep came easily now, not because I was exhausted, but because there was nothing waiting to ambush me in the dark. No rehearsed conversations, no contingency plans, no calculations running in the background, stealing rest in increments too small to notice until years had passed. In the morning, light returned, thin and pale at first, then warmer, consistent. Legacy used to feel abstract to me, a word invoked at conferences, wrapped in language about impact and vision, reduced to bullet points on slides that assumed permanence where none was guaranteed. It was something people discussed at the end of long careers, when the work itself had already concluded and only interpretation remained. Now, legacy feels smaller. It lives in repetition, in habits so ordinary they barely register as choices, in a quiet accumulation of moments that don't announce themselves as significant until much later, if ever. At Bright Path, teaching isn't hierarchical. No one stands at the front of the room dispensing wisdom. Knowledge moves laterally, passed from hand to hand, revised as it travels. A student who figured something out yesterday might be the one explaining it today, their confidence still fragile, but growing sturdier with each successful explanation. I learn as much as I teach. Not about code that language has long since settled into my bones, but about patience, about how differently people approach the same problem when they haven't yet been told what's supposed to matter. One afternoon, a girl named Alina argued with me. Not rudely, not defensively. She simply disagreed. I had suggested a more efficient approach to a function she was building. She listened, nodded, then said, "That works, but I like mine better." "Why?" I asked. She shrugged. "Understand it." That answer stopped me. Her solution wasn't elegant by industry standards. It wasn't optimized, but it worked, and more importantly, it belonged to her. She could explain every line without referring to notes, without guessing. I told her to keep it. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. There was a time when I would have insisted on the right way, when efficiency had been synonymous with value, when deviation felt like error rather than exploration. Watching her defend her approach reminded me that mastery isn't just about arriving at answers, it's about recognizing when understanding matters more than polish. Teaching, I realized, wasn't about replication. It was about permission. Permission to try, to fail without spectacle, to choose clarity over performance, to value comprehension over approval. These are lessons I had learned late. I watched students carry them with a naturalness that suggested they might avoid some of the detours I had taken. Not all of them, of course. No one escapes difficulty entirely, but perhaps fewer of the unnecessary ones. Every so often, someone asks why I don't formalize my involvement more, why I don't put my name on the building, why I don't launch a foundation with carefully branded initiatives and measurable outcomes, why I insist on remaining present rather than presiding. I never have a satisfying answer. The truth is simple but hard to defend in a culture that equates visibility with value. I don't want to be central. I've spent enough of my life being the axis around which things turned. It distorts relationships. It attracts the wrong kinds of attention. It encourages people to perform rather than participate. Here, I am useful without being necessary. If I disappeared tomorrow, Bright Path would continue. Someone else would sit in my chair. Someone else would help Mateo debug his code or remind Alina that her understanding mattered more than perfection. That thought doesn't threaten me. It comforts me. At home, the second bedroom slowly acquired purpose. Not all at once. Not with intention. A spare monitor appeared first, leaned against the wall for weeks before I decided where it belonged. A whiteboard followed, then a shelf for books I found myself lending out and not always getting back. I stopped minding. Ownership, I learned, wasn't the same as stewardship. Some things were meant to circulate. On weekends, I sometimes hosted small gatherings. Nothing formal. A few students, a colleague from Bright Path, occasionally Marisol, who never overstayed and always brought something warm. We cooked together, shared food that didn't require explanation, talked about things that mattered and things that didn't. No one asked me about Apex. When it came up, it did so obliquely, as background rather than centerpiece. I appreciated that more than I expected. It allowed me to inhabit the present without dragging my past behind me like a credential. I noticed how my body changed. The tension I'd carried in my shoulders eased. Sleep settled deeper. My hands stopped clenching unconsciously when conversations drifted toward uncertainty. I laughed more easily, not louder, but more often. These were not achievements I could list anywhere. They were, nonetheless, measurable. Sometimes late at night, I thought again about Ethan. Not the man he had become, but the boy he had been. The brother who once borrowed my jacket without asking and returned it with a tear he pretended not to notice. The teenager who believed the world owed him something because he hadn't yet learned how indifferent it could be. I wondered whether anyone had ever stayed for him the way someone had once stayed for me. That question no longer came with judgment, just curiosity. If the answer was no, it explained a great deal. If the answer was yes, it complicated things in ways I no longer needed to resolve. Either way, it wasn't mine to fix. Legacy, I understood now, wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about repairing every fracture or rewriting every ending into something more palatable. It was about choosing what you carried forward and what you laid down. I had laid down resentment. I had kept responsibility. There was a difference. On my desk sat a small notebook. Not for plans, not for strategies, just observations. Sentences overheard. Questions students asked that didn't have immediate answers. Ideas that didn't demand execution but felt worth preserving. One page read simply, "Consistency is love without the noise." I didn't remember writing it, but I recognized it as true. There are days now when nothing notable happens. No revelations. No symbolic encounters. No moments that would survive translation into a story someone else might want to tell. The morning passes. The afternoon follows. Evening arrives without announcement. Once, I would have mistaken that for stagnation. Now, I recognize it as health. The absence of drama is not emptiness. It is stability asserting itself quietly, asking nothing in return. At Bright Path, seasons mark time more reliably than calendars. Summer brings longer days and louder rooms. Fall introduces new students carrying fresh uncertainty like luggage they're not sure where to set down. Winter compresses everything inward, fewer words, more focus, breath visible in the early mornings. I move through these cycles without needing to dominate them. There's a freedom in being peripheral. I notice it most when I watch students struggle. Not catastrophically, just enough to learn something about themselves. When a solution refuses to work and frustration sharpens into self-doubt, my instinct is no longer to intervene immediately. I wait, not out of indifference, but respect. Struggle, I've learned, is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. Removing it too quickly robs people of the chance to recognize their own resilience. Staying present without rescuing, that is a skill I had to learn late and expensively. Sometimes a student looks up, eyes searching for confirmation. I nod. That's all. And more often than not, they return to the problem and solve it themselves. These moments accumulate quietly like sediment. They don't announce their importance. but they shape the landscape all the same. In the evenings, I walk, not for exercise, not for reflection, just because moving through the world without urgency feels right. The streets change subtly as the months pass new storefronts. Old ones shuttered, a tree removed, another planted. Nothing lasts. That truth no longer feels threatening. I think again, occasionally, about the person I used to be. Not with embarrassment, not with pride, just recognition. He was driven, focused, capable of extraordinary endurance when he believed the stakes demanded it. He also confused pressure with purpose, obligation with virtue. He believed that if he stayed long enough, gave enough, absorbed enough, things would eventually resolve themselves. They didn't. They clarified themselves instead. That distinction matters. Resolution suggests harmony, an ending where loose threads are neatly tied. Clarification is less generous. It reveals what is, not what we wish had been. It strips away the stories we tell ourselves to justify endurance that has become self-erasure. Clarification is harder to celebrate, but is far more useful. When I think of Ethan now, it is through that lens. Not as a villain, not as a victim, just as a man who made choices incompatible with mine. A man who mistook proximity for entitlement, history for obligation, access for ownership. I no longer ask whether things could have ended differently. They ended the only way they could have, given who we each became. That understanding brings no joy, but it brings peace. Peace, I've learned, is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. At home, the apartment has filled in around me, not with objects, but with rhythms. Morning light on the same patch of floor. The sound of keys placed in the same bowl. The unremarkable pleasure of knowing where everything is and that nothing is waiting to ambush me. I still receive messages from people who knew me before. Some are curious. Some are nostalgic. A few are disappointed that I no longer perform the role they found useful. I respond when it feels honest. I decline when it doesn't. Boundaries, once established, require maintenance but not defense. They simply exist. Late one evening, long after Bright Path had closed, I returned to the lab to retrieve a book I'd left behind. The building was dark, the silence deep and unoccupied. As I switched off the lights, I caught my reflection in the glass. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because the tension I'd come to associate with my own face was gone. My posture was unguarded, my expression neutral in a way that felt unfamiliar. I stood there longer than necessary, not out of vanity, out of acknowledgement. This was what remained when ambition loosened its grip, when obligation stopped masquerading as love, when legacy stopped being a future concern and became a present practice. What remained was not triumph. It was alignment. I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret choosing legacy over appeasement. And I don't regret telling this story not because it casts me favorably, but because it insists on something too often dismissed as naive, that patience, boundaries, and integrity still matter. Not as ideals, as daily acts. Some things don't need an audience, but some truths do. And this one finally felt complete. There are nights when the condo is so quiet I can hear the refrigerator click on and off. At first, that silence bothered me. After decades of noise, meetings, deadlines, arguments, negotiations, the absence of urgency felt unnatural, like I was forgetting something important. But over time, I learned that silence isn't empty. It's honest. In the old apartment, the one I sold after Ethan left, every room echoed with unresolved things. Unspoken anger, old conversations replaying themselves when I least expected them. Here, in this smaller place, the quiet feels earned. No one's trying to take anything from me anymore. I keep a photo on my desk now, not of Apex, not of awards or ceremonies. It's a picture of a group of kids standing in front of a whiteboard at Bright Path Labs. Half the code is wrong. Someone spelled a variable name incorrectly. Everyone's arguing over whose fault it is. They look frustrated. They look engaged. They look exactly like we did all those years ago, before ambition turned into entitlement, before shortcuts replaced work, before Ethan decided that winning mattered more than integrity. People sometimes ask me if I regret not reconciling. It's usually asked softly, carefully, as if they're worried the question itself might reopen something fragile. I always take a moment before answering, because reconciliation isn't just about reopening a door. It's about trusting that what's on the other side has changed. Ethan never wanted a relationship. He wanted access. Access to my time, my resources, my reputation. And when access was denied, he reached for leverage. That's not family. That's strategy. I did receive a message from him, months after the court dismissed the case. Just 3 words. I am sorry. No explanation. No acknowledgement. No responsibility. Just a sentence floating in isolation, untethered from action. I read it twice. Then I deleted it. Not out of spite, but because apologies that arrive after consequences without accountability are not bridges. They're exits. And I didn't need him trying to slip back in through another one. My days have become simpler. Mornings a bright path. Afternoons reading or walking the neighborhood. Evenings shared occasionally with people who don't care what I'm worth. Mrs. Alvarez across the hall knocks. Sometimes with leftovers she insists I try. Thomas from 2 doors down invites me to poker every Thursday. I lose more often than I win, which I secretly enjoy. None of them know my story. They don't need to. They know me as the man who shows up on time, listens, and keeps his word. That's enough. One evening, as I was packing up at Bright Path, Marisol stopped me at the door. You know, she said, you don't have to be here every week. I know, I replied. You could just write checks. I smiled. That's not the point. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Kids notice, she said, when adults stay. That might be the truest thing anyone has said to me in years. Legacy isn't about being remembered loudly. It's about being felt quietly, long after you're gone. Leonard understood that. He never wanted his name on buildings. He wanted his work to outlive him through people who did things the right way. I try to honor that now. Not perfectly, just honestly. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Some people will always see relationships as transactions. They measure affection by what they can extract. They confuse proximity with entitlement. And when you don't give them what they think they deserve, they will call you cold, cruel, or selfish. Let them. Boundaries don't make you heartless. They make you safe. I don't hate my brother. Hate requires energy, attention, investment. I've spent enough of my life investing in things that didn't return value. What I feel instead is clarity, the kind that arrives late but stays. I am 65 years old. Statistically, I have fewer years ahead of me than behind, and I intend to spend what remains deliberately. Teaching a kid how to debug code, listening when someone needs to talk, building things that don't collapse when shortcuts are removed. That's my version of success now. If you're watching this and facing a similar choice between appeasing someone who wronged you and protecting what you've built, know this. You are not obligated to sacrifice your future to ease someone else's guilt. Forgiveness does not require access, and family is not defined by blood, but by behavior. Choose carefully. It's never too late to choose correctly. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that patience and principle still matter, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. I read more of them than you'd think.